Control is a game that I thoroughly regret passing up when it first released. I can't really say why I never played it. In fact, I bought it shortly after release and even played the first couple hours. But for some reason, I put it down and waited until last week to pick it back up. Control is exactly what I look for in a game. The gameplay loop is fast-paced and frenetic, and there's no shortage of ways to dispatch your enemies. The game looks beautiful. Every aspect of its central location, the oldest house, is beautiful, dark, and creepy. Control was developed by Remedy Entertainment, who you may know from games like Max Payne and Alan Wake. Remember that last one, as Alan Wake actually has a role to play in one of Control's DLCs. Control was released in 2019 for the 8th generation of consoles. All footage captured here was done so on the PC version. Control was the first game released by Remedy following their break with Microsoft Publishing. This resulted in a much quicker development cycle compared to previous releases with Microsoft and allowed Control to fly in way under budget when compared to most modern AAA games. Towards the end of development on Quantum Break, director Mikhail Kasurinen suggested that they focus on an open-world game for their next project. He pushed the idea that they would focus less on narrative and give players more agency to explore and uncover story elements for themselves. The game is crammed full of audio logs, documents, and videos that the player can find and view throughout the game. And despite wanting to give the players more freedom of exploration, the game still features a focused and compelling narrative. The game was written by Sam Lake, who has had his fingerprints all over Remedy's many projects, including writing for Max Payne and Alan Wake, and as creative director for Quantum Break. Control is set in the oldest house, which serves as a headquarters for a shadowy government organization known as the Federal Bureau of Control. The FBC is responsible for studying the paranatural. This includes objects of power that can grant the wielder powerful abilities and AWEs, or altered world events, which can include a variety of effects. The Bureau answers only to the Board, an entity that takes the form of a pyramid and exists within the astral plane. The FBC operates largely outside of the influence of the larger U.S. government. The oldest house has many paranatural qualities that keep it hidden from the general public. It is said it can only be found by someone who is specifically looking for it, despite it existing as a physical skyscraper in New York City. The Bureau obtains its funding through the U.S. government. A document in-game details how, as long as the budget remains under a certain amount, the federal government will always approve it, no questions asked. The building is much larger on the inside than it is on the outside, and is also prone to shifting its architecture in unpredictable ways. The Bureau is able to utilize the building by using so-called control points to stabilize certain areas. Now, before I get into the plot breakdown, I want to warn that the rest of the video will be filled with spoilers, so if you haven't played the game, pause here and do so now. It is well worth your time. Just promise you'll come back and watch the rest of this video once you get to the credits. Control follows Jessie Faden. Jessie and her brother Dylan were at the center of an altered world event in the town of Ordinary, Maine. The two children accidentally unleashed paranatural forces after they discovered a slide projector that turned out to be an object of power. While the adult population of Ordinary vanished, Dylan and Jessie were saved by the enigmatic and telepathic entity known as Polaris. The entity attached itself to Jessie and helped her escape when the FBC came to investigate, but while Jessie made it out, Dylan was taken by the Bureau, along with the slide projector that started it all. 17 years later, Jessie has arrived at the oldest house to finally rescue her brother and find out what happened all those years ago. Upon entering the building, we find it seemingly deserted. Empty offices, papers all over the place. We find cryptic memos warning against the possession of archetypal items. Some reports are heavily redacted with large portions of text blacked out. The first person we meet is actually the janitor, Ati. He seems to think we are his new assistant. He directs us to the elevator. We make our way to the director's office only to find him dead on the ground next to his desk, shot in the head. Suicide. His gun lying next to him. The entity in Jessie's head urges her to pick up the weapon. As soon as we touch the gun, we're treated to a vision, a communication from the board, an as yet unknown entity taking the form of a pyramid. It names us as the new director and gives us the power to wield the service weapon. This is our first interaction with an object of power. Upon exiting the director's office, we are attacked by the main enemy of the game. The employees here have been corrupted by some sort of force that Jessie has dubbed the Hiss. These Hiss security guards go down easy thanks to our service weapon. We fight our way further into the Bureau, and we find our first control point. These serve as our checkpoints. They allow us to fast travel, level up, and craft various upgrades and mods for our service weapon. Think bonfires in Dark Souls. Upon cleansing the control point, we find a group of uncorrupted employees that were hiding in the nearby safe room. We meet Emily Pope, assistant to Dr. Darling, the head of research. She immediately recognizes us as the new director and tells us that the only way to protect yourself from the hiss is through use of a device called an HRA. For some reason, Jesse is entirely immune. Pope asks us to venture further into the oldest house and cleanse more control points as it seems to drive out the hiss. Control gets off to an incredibly strong start here. The oldest house gives off this sense of foreboding and mystery that has me immediately desperate to go deeper and get more info.
This happen. You can't let 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 this happen.
Walking out of the director's office to see the dark hallway bathed in deep red and the bodies floating in the air took my breath away and made me hesitant to step forward. Our next task is to locate the hotline, another object of power. This is how the director communicates with the board. Emily Pope believes we can use this to talk to the previous director, Trench. Perhaps he knows more about what we're up against and how to stop it. Initially, I found the oldest house very hard to navigate. The map that you get is very confusing and hard to read, but what I learned quickly is you should entirely ignore it. The map is really unnecessary. The level design here is extremely strong and very intuitive. The best way to navigate is really just to look at your surroundings, follow the conveniently placed signs, and you'll almost always find your way. And if you find your way blocked, the alternate route is typically very easy to find. So we head off to communications to obtain the hotline. We fight more Hiss soldiers. We're pretty weak right now. The only offensive capabilities available to us at this early stage are our service weapon with its default firing mode. So we blast our way through and read some more documents on the way. On our way to communications, we find a recording of Dr. Darling, head of research, talking about an object of power in the form of a floppy disk. There are several of these videos by Darling, and they are one of my favorite things about the game. Darling's love for his job just oozes through the projector. He talks so excitedly about the most dangerous paranatural objects known to man, like he's Bill Nye the Science Guy. Here's a full clip of one of these videos.
Just look at it. 8 inches wide and capable of storing a whopping 80 kilobytes. Stolen by our friends at the CIA, the disk held the launch codes to Soviet nukes. This is not the disk, of course, but one exactly like it. A perfect fusion of concepts vibrating in the Cold War era collective unconscious. A receptacle. It is a receptacle for dangerous energies to hone in on, and they did. We don't have the details, but when things started flying around the disk, it was transferred to us. It's an object of power. OOP. Oops. Oh, and it can launch things telekinetically through the air. To date, we've launched maybe 3 dozen pencils. And once, we even launched a cup.
Soon after this, we find the object of power Darling was talking about, the floppy disk. This gives us our first psychic ability and my personal favorite, launch. You'll be seeing me launch a lot of objects in this gameplay footage. I was completely addicted to hurling anything and everything at my enemies. And not only does it do considerable damage, but you don't have to aim it, and that's good for me, as I'm not exactly Arthur Morgan when it comes to accuracy. Entering into communications, we find our first boss, Department Head Tomasi. He actually really gave me some trouble at this early stage. With his own telekinetic powers, he was immune to mine, and this left me with just my service weapon and my previously mentioned subpar aiming. This on top of the fact that he hits like a truck and I didn't have the dodge unlocked meant I had a couple of deaths under my belt now. We eventually defeat him and find the hotline, however it's unreachable. There's a wide gap between me and the phone, with a conveniently placed cord hanging from the ceiling. Pulling this cord 3 times teleports me to the Ocean View Hotel. This is going to be a very common location in this game, so get used to seeing it. Inside the Ocean View is a locked door with a pyramid on it and a bell to ding at the front desk. Remembering the sign by the light cord about the rule of 3, I ding the bell 3 times and a door opens. I find the key I need and get into the locked door where there's another cord I pull 3 times. It takes me back to the bureau where I can now access the hotline. Trench advises us to speak with his management team, however the internal lockdown is preventing us from accessing the other sectors, so our first stop is down to maintenance so we can perform a directorial override. We need to find Ati, the janitor from the beginning of the game. We find the janitor's office, but right next to it is another object of power, and I can't resist obtaining more abilities, so I make a quick detour to collect the merry-go-round horse. This gives us the second best power in the game, the dodge. This ability is going to save my bacon around 1,000 times this playthrough. We enter the janitor's office to find Ati. He says he'll help us get to the override, but first we need to help him. There's always a catch. We have to hurry and fix both the coolant pumps and the power generators, otherwise the whole power plant will explode. So we go and do that. Down here in maintenance, we're introduced to some new enemy types. Some guards now have shields that make bullets quite ineffective. Luckily for us, hucking some random bullshit at their heads is highly effective. We also see some enemies similar to Tomasi that float in the air and throw objects at you, and just like Tomasi, they will dodge anything you throw using telekinesis, so you just have to shoot them. The final enemy introduced down here are some floating dudes that don't really attack, they just float up to you and explode. They're largely easy to deal with as they have low health, but if they sneak up on you and you're caught in the blast, it can be devastating. Fighting our way through maintenance, we find the energy converters and come up against a puzzle you'll be seeing many more times in this game. We have to use telekinesis to pick up batteries and throw them into their plugs, so that's what we do. On our way to the coolant pumps, we cleanse an object of power in the form of a safe. This gives us the shield ability, and take a good look, folks, because this is going to be one of the only times you see me use this power. I'm not saying it's a bad power or that it's useless, I just didn't capture much footage of it because I kept forgetting it existed unless I accidentally pressed the button. My philosophy in action games tends to be that the best defense is a strong offense. The enemies can't kill you if they're already dead. It's the same reason you won't see me using a shield very often in a FromSoft game. We find and fix the coolant pumps, which includes a segment where I have to go into the pipes and clear out some gunk, but not before it goos all over me. Ugh. Now we can make our way to the control room, and we open all the other sectors in the Bureau. Now back to Emily to plan our next move. We tell Emily about Polaris, the entity attached to Jesse. Polaris is clearly tied deeply to the Bureau. Pope tells us about some case files she can't access, but they seem to point us in the direction of Jesse's brother, Dylan. Our next stop is research to track down head of operations, Marshall, who may know more. We fight our way down to research, which has to be one of my favorite areas in this game. This place is full of interesting documents and more videos created by Dr. Darling. We find Marshall, and surprise, surprise, she has a task for us. Several thrown desks, chairs, and rocks later, we secure the lab for Marshall and solve a fun little puzzle. She sends us on another detour to the quarry. After finally securing materials for Marshall to build more HRAs, she finally spills the beans. Dylan is here in the building. He has been since he was taken. He's known as Prime Candidate 6. He was meant to be groomed as the next director of the FBC. Dylan had powers beyond the Bureau's wildest expectations, but he couldn't handle them. He ended up killing members of the Bureau, and he's been in containment ever since. We head off to rescue Dylan from his containment, but before we go, Marshall begs us not to free him. She tells us he's too dangerous to be set loose. We get to the Panopticon where Dylan is being held, but we have to do something else first. Supervisor Langston asks us to help stop an object of power in the form of an old TV. It's apparently wreaking havoc in this sector. This is the containment area for lots of objects of power and alternate items. If left unchecked, the TV could set them all loose, which would be very bad, so we agree to help. On our way to the TV, we find an employee who's watching a fridge. He begs us to relieve him. He's been in there for days without sleep or contact with others. He explains that the only thing that keeps the fridge in check is observation. If he looks away, something bad might happen. Unfortunately, we can't relieve him just yet, so we leave him to continue staring. The TV is being guarded by Salvador, head of security. There's another boss fight, and I'm not going to talk much about the boss fights in this game, as they're mainly just regular enemies with bigger health bars. They aren't bad, they're just kind of there. Cleansing the TV gives us the power to fly, and I love this ability. After obtaining this, I spend more time in the air than on the ground. And once you've obtained launch, levitate, and dodge, the game's combat really starts to shine. I fell very nicely into the loop of taking to the skies, launching anything I could get my hands on, and then dashing out to regain my energy. This combat system gives you so many options, and it gets so chaotic it fed my ADHD brain exactly what it needed, and I have got to find another game with combat like this. Moving up to maximum security, we find Dylan's cell has been torn apart. He's already escaped, but before we have time to ponder where he might have gone, we get a call from Emily. Dylan's with her. He's given himself up. The hiss has gotten to him, but it's different than how it normally affects people. We rush back to Central Executive to see him. He's been placed in a cell and isolated. Upon seeing him, it becomes clear that he is not the same as he once was. He floats several inches off the floor and chants cryptic nonsense. He no longer thinks of himself as Dylan Faden, but simply as P6. Dylan becomes quickly aware of the presence of Polaris and he begins to freak out. Clearly not a fan. He's angry because Polaris protected Jesse while allowing him to be taken and experimented on by the FBC. He reminds Jesse of what started the Alter World event in Ordinary all those years ago, the slide projector. An object of power. He reveals that when they tested it here in the Bureau, they opened some kind of dimensional door and let the hiss in. We head off to Dimensional Research to find the slide projector and turn it off once again as we did in Ordinary. We find one of Darling's last videotapes where he's clearly hanging onto his sanity by a thread.
Despite what you may have heard, HRAs are not monitoring devices. We're not tracking your movements or listening to your conversations while you're wearing them. We do that regardless whether or not you're wearing an HRA. Think of them as a life preserver. Only instead of water, the thing HRAs protect you from is classified.
A strange, shifting maze stands in our way. Perhaps Ahti knows how to get through, so we go find him. Back in maintenance, we find ourselves in Ahti's office. Unfortunately, he's not here. He's gone on vacation. In the middle of lockdown somehow. He's clearly operating outside of the normal rules of the oldest house. We're guided by visions left by Ahti through maintenance. Eventually, we're led to a restricted area, a dark, foggy, seemingly endless open room. Here's where we finally find Ahti. He gives us his cassette player and we head back to the ashtray maze. What follows is one of the greatest gameplay segments I've ever experienced in gaming. We navigate through the shifting maze while fighting enemies and listening to some kick-ass music. You know what? Just look. We make it to the Hedron, a massive object of power and the source of Polaris. Jessie is in awe and decides she must free Hedron. We fight our way up the room, turning off the siphons, holding it in place as we go. Upon releasing Hedron, Polaris leaves us and Jessie is taken over by the hiss. Roll credits.
Happiness comes. White pearls reveal.
Nah, I'm kidding. That would be crazy, though. We find ourselves in some sort of dream, in a pre-hiss bureau. Jessie serving as assistant to the previous director, Trench. Jessie quickly realizes what's happening, and with some encouragement from Ahti, we break free of the hiss's control. Trench calls Jessie on the hotline and instructs her to go to his office. Inside, we find a light cord and enter the Ocean View Motel for the last time, and oh, well, there's this.
But she turned up just the same. There was a knock on the door, a thump on the floor, and the party turned insane as she called out her name.
Anyway, we find our way back to ourselves. Hedron is destroyed and Jessie reconnects with Polaris. She speculates on the relationship between Polaris and Hedron. If Polaris came from Hedron or was merely awakened by it. Accepting that she may never understand, she heads to the nostalgia department to finally shut off the slide projector and shut out the hiss for good. We're presented with one final combat gauntlet. These enemies are much more powerful than anything we've seen thus far. Luckily, the board has helpfully amped us up to compensate. We dash, fly, launch, and shoot our way to Dylan, who's now at the center of this. We cleanse Dylan, but this leaves him in a coma, uncertain whether he'll ever wake up again. The portal has been closed, but Jessie makes it clear that her work is not done. The hiss is still present, and her job as director is to finish clearing it out. And that's Control. It's beautiful and creepy. The story was slightly hard to follow at times, given how cryptic it is. You really feel connected to Jessie as it goes on, and motivated just as much as she is to find answers, even if they may not be the ones you wanted to find. The combat in this game is unlike anything else I've played. It flows perfectly with each ability being powerful and unique, and when you start to get good at combining them together, you feel like a psychic demigod. With so many different upgrades and forms that the service weapon can take and the number of skills that are acquirable, there's room to experiment with any playstyle that suits you. I can't recommend Control enough to anyone who enjoys fast-paced third-person action games, or to those who just want some light spooks. Let me know in the comments below what games you'd like to see me cover in the future, and thanks for watching if you made it this far. See ya!